you very much, and thanks for the opportunity of being here. And also thanks for the opportunity of starting to think about some new questions that I've been wanting to think about for a long time, but I've never had really the chance to. So for this reason, what I'm going to say is really preliminary, and I haven't really, I've thought of it, but I haven't really conceptualized it fully. So I really hope that the conversation later on will help me conceptualize further what I'm presenting now. So the title of my presentation is Retreat as Belonging, What if there were not gated communities? And what triggered the interest, okay, I've been working on gated communities for a long time in South Africa. And recently, in the last couple of years, in the context of the project on taxation and state formation that I've been working on with Alisi, I've visited Cameroon quite a few times. And in Cameroon, I've been struck precisely by the absence of gated communities. And this seems to be a counter trend to what happens in the contemporary world, especially in the global south, but in the entire globe generally. So what I'm trying to do here is trying to understand under what conditions there are not gated communities, and especially why people reject the concept of gated communities, given that it is such a widespread and such a deep and pervasive mode of habitation all around. So the literature on gated communities has been going on for now since the 90s, I think, and it's been very dichotomic. There's some people that agree, think that gated community are spaces of efficiency and thus we need them, but of course there's also a lot of critique. Recently, in 2017, at the UN Habitat conference in Quito, Richard Sennett declares that gated communities are the community of choice, but they must be declared illegal. And this is what happens now in the publication of the Quito Papers, which is a publication that comes out of the UN Habitat conference, in which it is basically argued that for us to have a democratic and accessible and open city, we really have to declare gated communities illegal, among other things, of course. So really the context of this presentation is the contemporary city, a space in which inequalities are manifested, and a great deal of attention is devoted to the cities of the global south, where patterns of inequality seem to be starker and more visible in many different ways. So in this context, the city has been qualified as fragmented, segregated, unequal, splintered, closed, and basically in very negative connotations, without though really paying attention to the nature of the city and to the nature of the spaces that are created within the city. Gated communities, as I said, have been tackled as one of the main problems of contemporary cities. So they are expression of inequality in the city and of a new enclavism. Mike Davis and Teresa Caldera talk also of gated communities as a response to the urban fear, even though I have to declare that I tend not to think of security, safety and security when I study or talk about gated community, because I think it is overpowering, and if we just look at gated communities via the lens of security, we'll end up only talking about security and missing out many other dynamics that are quite important and underlining the presence of gated communities. Bauman has talked of gated communities are the manifestation of self-segregation, and also the result of neoliberal trend of the economy and the rampant individualism. So basically gated communities have been framed as an object of analysis, but we have not really developed analytical tools to understand the presence of this urban form and also what it means. Of course, they are also the manifestation of a change of economic regime. In terms of, in temporal terms, gated communities all over the world have been associated to periods of of transition. So transition to democracy mostly. There are many examples of mushrooming of gated communities in Eastern Europe in the end of the 80s. And in South Africa, for example, gated, where most of my field work and the empirical data for this presentation is based, gated communities start to appear in the late 80s, 90s. And it coincides, of course, with the end of apartheid. So the critiques are that they reproduce all patterns of exclusion and segregation, and in a way a form of selected citizenship. They represent the space in which the rich retreat, separated and disengaged from other spaces of the city. So another critique important to the gated communities is that they represent spaces of retreat of the successful. But there is a slight little problem with this because there are extremely many different kinds of gated communities. So we can't just talk of gated communities if it were something monolithic. So there are gated communities for the lower middle class, for the emerging middle class, upper middle class, the super rich, and it's actually very dangerous to conflate all of them in one category. One thing that they share, though, is a similar system of governance. So there is usually a homeowners association or a body corporate that administers the life of the gated communities, the estate, or complexes and everything. So, as I said, I'm really interested to understand why and under what circumstances are these we don't have gated communities, given that it's so pervasive and so present everywhere. And if the gated communities have become the new way of life, as we'll see, and what many aspire to, because of course for the emerging middle class, one of the explanations is that these are places of aspiration. So the question would be, what are the desirable spaces to live where gated communities are not prominent? And what other spaces citizens aspire to, and what kind of social and political life is created when these are not offered? And finally, why these are not being marketed in some context, because of course there's also a market relation thing. So, without doubt, these are spaces of exclusion, but the question is to understand how differently from other spaces they reproduce these patterns of exclusion. Because the problem with the literature on gated communities is that it tends to overpower the presence of gated communities, actually, and tend to look at these spaces as if they were the only one in which exclusion is played out. So I'm going to give a little an example of South Africa, Johannesburg, as I said, and Cameroon. So in South Africa, the gated community now has become really the new way of life. So it's widespread and it takes different shapes and forms. So we have gated estates, which already also take many different forms, but I'm not going to go through all of them. There's townhouse complexes, which are mostly spaces where the emergent middle class aspire to go. But recently, and this is quite a recent trend, affordable housing that are built outside of the township or in low class, say, suburbs, also follow the model of the gated community. So it's something that is going across class and across spaces as a different new mode of governance of spaces and also people. For my interest, I'm looking at gated estates of the upper middle class. So already I'm defining a particular one. So briefly, they are managed by homeowners association, and the cost of the management is bared and shared by all of the owners. I'm sure, as everyone knows, access is limited only to the residents. And in the particular South African case, what is interesting is that they represent the new way of life. So through my work, previous work on gated communities, what's become very clear is that what gated communities in South Africa for the upper middle class / elite, but are places in which there is an instantiation of the idea of a worthy community. So a community that is good, that is worth something more than other people. And this is done thanks to the efficient system of governance that works and cooperates with the local municipality. And I'm going to explain this just now. So in South Africa, I find that gated communities are not only spaces of retreat. So they are spaces that define the standard of the good life, of course, but also provide a system of justification to it. So they provide a system of justification for the residents to be there and be comfortable being there. And this is done via the action of the governing institution, which is the Homeowners Association, which is crucial in these dynamics, as it provides the good and efficient environment that accommodates the needs of a population that feels totally entitled to it. So, I've been able to come to this idea of gated communities as spaces of retreat, actually working in comparison between what happens with inside gated communities and what happens in wealthy suburbs that are not gated and that share in some ways the same level of exclusivity and the same lifestyle. So what happens in Gulf estate, in estates or gated communities, the way we want to define that, is that the residents of the estate, through the action of the Homeowners Association and its efficient organization, move out of the city. So, and I'm going to explain this. And thanks to the estate, re-enter the nation and express their love to the country. So instead of thinking of the gated community as of a bubble, as something that stands in the city where there are many, I think it is important to look at gated communities as systems that are part of the city, but also as systems that are fully incorporated in the nation, in the state. So we could say that the gated community is something like a bubble of belonging. So because of the stigma associated to living in a Gulf estate, the Homeowners Association, which is the manager of the gated community, is vested in creating a community of commitment. So it's vested in creating a group of people that are actually engaged in something, engaged in the internal community of the state or like in the external community with charity work and with things like this. So socially, so that the community feels worthy of being there and entitled, justifying the entitlement. So socially, the worth of the community is about being accepted as eligible and a fitting presence in the country. And residents describe and value each other according to parameters and values that are intrinsically connected to the South African society. So to reinforce the fact that these people are not out of the city, but they're actually part of the country. Okay, so of course then what kind of belonging are we talking about? They wish to be part of the new country because of course the way in which the community is created within these spaces is an idea of a new community, especially in the South African case, of a heterogeneous community, to counterpart the idea that within these places we have only homogeneous groups in racial terms, especially in racial terms, and that actually it is a space in which there is the creation of the good citizen. So it's not someone that doesn't care about anything else that is going on outside. Someone that is actually fully engaged. So the ones that live in gated communities show appreciation for South Africa, and precisely thanks to the privilege of being able to be there, they show how from within the state they are able to make South Africa better under those conditions. The state becomes then the place from which the upper middle class claims to contribute to improving the country. Living in the state becomes a means of to reaffirming active citizenship in a way. Of course, there is no desire at all of direct political power. It's actually a space in which we just want to maintain what we have. I mean, we want to just justify it, we want to feel entitled, but we want to maintain it. We don't necessarily want more. It's enough what we have. But rather desire to be able to continue to live following the same lifestyle. So this is more or less the picture that you have in South Africa. And also I think in Johannesburg it's important to say that the idea of the gated community, I mean the way of living is crystallized in the gated community and is very visible in the gated community. But if we go and we drive past the city, we actually have the idea that we live in a gated community. There's walls everywhere anyways. There's private security everywhere. So actually the difference is really blurred. So in Cameroon, Yaoundé, which is the capital city, and where these are the places that I've seen the most and which I've got more empirical data and way of understanding them. So the country is strikingly characterized by the absence of gated communities. And I say strikingly because in Africa it's actually one of the few countries in which there's no gated communities. And in all of its conventional forms. So there's no gated community at all, both in urban and rural areas. So of course there are new habitations, new form of habitations, but they mostly consist of freestanding houses. So people that build and build a lot build freestanding houses, and only occasionally apartment blocks. But it is worth noting that every time that the state subsidizes apartment blocks for the middle class and for the, civil servants, since the 70s, none of them have been successful, precisely because people have been given the apartments. Over time, they've bought them and have totally changed them. And there is actually an incredible need to assert the identity and preference and through this owning a house and actually making it the way people like. One major difference between Cameroon and South Africa, though, and I have to say that this is not a comparison, because I know that these are two very different countries. So this is not a comparison. I'm just trying to see what makes that in Cameroon we have no gated communities, just to try to understand why we have so many gated communities in other places. So this is by far a comparison. It is not, because I understand it's very difficult to compare these two places. In Cameroon there is no idea of the new country at all. So there's no transition. Well, there's been transition to formal democracy, but since the 60s there's been great change. So there's no idea, there's no the feeling of living in a new society. And discussions are around the impossibility of triggering change in a very undemocratic context. So it's very different to South Africa. In South Africa, we think that these spaces actually are the spaces in which the new way of life in a new country takes place. In Cameroon, we are not given this chance because there is no idea of what a new country might be. There is no transition hangover. So building a house or living in a certain way is not associated to participating or contributing to the country, of course. There is no this kind of, but mostly is seen as a personal fulfillment. Differently, yeah. So given the political situation in the country, the wealthy don't feel the urge to justify how they live. And the process itself of building is considered a process of active engagement and negotiation. And I'm going to say just now how. Of course, it is a place where it is difficult to have bonds from the bank, where there is not of international capital flowing for construction purposes. And there are many personal networks at play to actually being able to build a house. Given this context, some preliminary conclusion on ownership and belonging and active citizenship. So in South Africa, and especially the urban areas, the exercise of reinforcing belonging to the nation is done by via moving into gated estates. And in Cameroon, in the urban areas, it is done by actively building freestanding houses, so engaging with the process of building. So the active citizen of the gated community in South Africa feels already a good citizen for voting and for contributing to the country, because I think this is important. Having basic institutions at play, like knowing that the vote counts in South Africa. There's possibility of changing the government. Okay, the ANC has been in power for a long time, but people vote with the hope or the idea that it's possible to change. The gated community provides the space for emphasizing the worth of the citizens. So the basic participation of political life provides the space for changing the terms in belonging and justify the choice of living in such a space, such as that of the gated community. On the contrary, the active citizen of the freestanding house in Cameroon does not need to prove its engagement to formal institutions, nor via paying taxes, nor via voting, because he knows that, his engagement in these terms is worth nothing. And yes, the cities do have a lot of public space, but there is no public engagement. So his way of engaging is direct, but is more informal. It is just for means of constructions. And how does he engage? The citizens, the active citizen in Cameroon, engages with the local municipality to have access to land, to have the title deeds, and it's a whole process of negotiation. And it's really a process, the only way, the only time in which the citizens actually engage to get something back from the state, in a way. So ownership plays a different role. In South Africa, it represents the individual in a collective setup, while in Cameroon it represents the individual alone. So finally, so what would it mean if we were to remove the walls of the gated communities? Would it mean that we had a better, more democratic, more accessible city, a more inclusive society? I think that, and this is really tentative again, there is realization of the person in Cameroon is in building the house, which becomes also the way to engage with the state in a context in which there is no major other engagement. So the democratic arena is very thin, and be a good citizen is really about feeling Cameroonian, not making demands, being quiet, and engaging. Well, this is the case. There's been a whole process of identity construction based on the fact that all of the ethnicities had to be separated, and no one has to make demands to be the good ethnicity, so that in case finally freedom comes, everyone can potentially have access to it. So gated communities in this sense will deny even further this kind of engagement. So in Cameroon, the love for the country is expressed extremely different to South Africa. There's a very strong national identity, and there's a very strong repulsion of xenophobia, for example, because this is how the identity is built. So not having gated communities doesn't directly mean having a much more open and democratic society in this case. And I think this conceptually can help us understand also other places in which gated communities don't play. So if we have to remove the wall in South Africa, well, obviously the upper middle class would look for other ways to live in the country. So would engage other forms, other institutions. I mean, if we didn't have the wall, and it's actually enough to see the life in the suburbs where there's no gated communities, but things don't change greatly. So both South African and Cameroon, the Cameroonian upper middle class, negotiate their identity and justify their position in society in very different way. So, and this is actually important vis-a-vis how we see the relationship of engagement and active engagement with the city and the nation.